Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the absolutely most consequential endeavors in human history. We're talking about the Manhattan Project. Now, it's often remembered simply as a military initiative, the one that produced the first atomic bombs. But when you really dig into the declassified files and historical records, it reveals itself to be this massive, sprawling puzzle. It's a story of unprecedented science, incredibly high-stakes espionage, and global geopolitics that quite literally reshaped our entire world. But before we even get into the science, just think about this staggering question for a second. How exactly do you hide a $2 billion project? And to put that in perspective, that's equivalent to nearly $28 billion today. Plus, it involved 130,000 people. That right there is the core paradox of the Manhattan Project. It was an industrial effort of just unimaginable scale, yet somehow it operated under a cloak of absolute impenetrable secrecy. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break this explainer down into 5 distinct parts. We'll start with the impossible scale of the project, then look at the intense scientific hurdles of cracking the nuclear code. From there, we'll examine the extreme culture of secrecy, the dramatic reality of Soviet espionage, and finally wrap up with the lingering geopolitics of the atomic age. Right, so part 1, the impossible scale. When we think of the Manhattan Project, we usually picture, solitary physicists scribbling complex equations on chalkboards. But the reality is that it was a sprawling industrial empire. It took an estimated 130,000 Americans working across dozens of secret facilities in the US and Canada between 1941 and 1946 just to make this theoretical science a reality. We're not just talking about remote desert camps here. These were entire, fully functioning secret cities built entirely from scratch. And the workforce fueling this giant machine was incredibly diverse. You had your construction workers and clerks, of course. Then you had thousands of young women known as the Calotron Girls, who were out there operating massive isotope separators in Tennessee. You had the world's absolute top theoretical physicists. And as declassified documents now highlight, you had brilliant African-American scientists making crucial contributions. People like J. Ernest Wilkins Jr., who really advanced the theoretical understanding of nuclear physics, and William Jacob Knox Jr., who was instrumental in the extraction and processing of fissionable uranium. So it was a massive, collective push. Moving on to part 2, cracking the nuclear code. Building this bomb wasn't just some tough engineering challenge. It meant mastering elements that barely even existed in nature. The first major hurdle was the uranium problem. To build a bomb, scientists desperately needed uranium-235. That's a super rare fissionable isotope. The catch? Naturally mined uranium is almost entirely uranium-238, which is completely non-fissile. The stuff they actually needed, uranium-235, makes up only 0.7% of it. So finding and extracting it was literally a needle in a haystack situation. And because the two isotopes are chemically identical, they couldn't just use normal chemical reactions. They had to be separated physically. The project spent vast fortunes building enormous facilities at Oak Ridge to separate them using incredibly complex methods, like electromagnetic separation and gaseous diffusion. Now, once you actually get the material, you have to achieve what's called critical mass. Simply put, this is the minimum amount of fissile material you need to sustain a runaway nuclear chain reaction. For a bare sphere of uranium-235, that's about 15 kilograms. For plutonium, it's even less, about 10 kilograms. The incredibly terrifying challenge here was figuring out how to bring these separate pieces of material together into a critical mass fast enough to cause a massive explosion, rather than having the whole thing just melt down prematurely. And project documents brilliantly illustrate the sheer, mind-boggling difficulty of working with the alternative material, plutonium. They were trying to produce plutonium on an industrial scale using nuclear reactors out at Hanford, Washington. Chemists had to deal with an element whose properties were, frankly, largely unknown. The records point out that plutonium reactions are vastly complicated by its multiple oxidation states, not to mention the immense health hazards and extreme toxicity involved. They were essentially writing the textbook on a brand new element while simultaneously trying to build a weapon out of it. And this intense chemistry led directly to what became known as the plutonium crisis. Detailed in the famous Los Alamos primer, scientists in the summer of 1944 received their very first batch of reactor-bred plutonium and quickly realized they had a massive problem. It was contaminated with an isotope called plutonium-240, which had an unacceptably high rate of spontaneous fission. Basically, if they tried to shoot two pieces of this plutonium together inside a gun barrel mechanism, which, by the way, was their original, relatively simple design, the background neutrons would cause it to pre-detonate. The bomb would literally melt itself before assembling into a full critical mass. So, just like that, the gun-type bomb was dead in the water for plutonium. So the scientists at Los Alamos had to ingeniously pivot to save the plutonium bomb, and that pivot was the implosion solution. Instead of a gun mechanism, they decided to shape the plutonium into hollow hemispheres, surround that core with complex interlocking lenses of conventional high explosives, and then detonate them all at the exact same microsecond. The resulting shockwave would rapidly squeeze the plutonium inward, compressing it into a solid critical mass. It was incredibly difficult to calculate, let alone actually engineer, but amazingly, it worked. Which brings us to part 3, the culture of absolute secrecy. Navigating all those scientific hurdles required immense collaboration, but General Leslie Groves, the military director of the project, enforced a culture of extreme operational security that often completely clashed with the scientific method itself. Now, what's really interesting when looking at historical laboratory philosophy documents is the deep tension they reveal. Groves was all about strict compartmentalization. He wanted a rigid need-to-know policy where workers only knew their specific task, ensuring no single person could grasp the full picture. But J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director, successfully pushed back. He argued that to solve unprecedented, mind-bending problems like implosion, scientists absolutely needed open academic discussion. So they struck a compromise. There would be severe external isolation behind barbed wire, but relatively free scientific exchange within the confines of Los Alamos itself. For anyone outside of the top scientists, however, the secrecy was absolute. There's this chilling quote from a manager speaking to the young women operating the Calatrons at Oak Ridge. He said, "I can only tell you that if our enemies beat us to it, God have mercy on us." Think about that pressure. These workers sat there for hours, day after day, monitoring mysterious dials and adjusting needles without ever knowing they were actively enriching uranium to split the atom. If they asked too many questions, they were immediately replaced or just disappeared from the site. Part 4. Espionage and Soviet Spies. And here is the dramatic irony of the whole Manhattan Project. Despite unprecedented internal security, 400,000 background checks, and strict mail censorship, the secret was still leaking right out the back door. The Soviet Union recognized the strategic importance of atomic research super early on. By 1943, their intelligence networks were actively trying to penetrate the project. And the most significant breach? That happened in 1944 when Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant physicist, arrived at Los Alamos as part of the British mission. Fuchs was intimately involved in the incredibly secret implosion design calculations, and he was quietly passing this vital information to Soviet couriers right under the noses of the counterintelligence corps. His activities weren't fully uncovered until 1950. The impact of this espionage was just profound. By stealing those complex implosion designs that took the absolute top minds at Los Alamos years of painful, tedious trial and error to perfect, Soviet spies allowed their own atomic program to bypass years of developmental roadblocks. As the historical sources note, this directly broke the American monopoly on atomic weapons much, much faster than anticipated, which fundamentally altered the entire post-war balance of power. Finally, let's look at Part 5, Geopolitics of the Atomic Age. The successful Trinity test in July 1945, and then the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't just end a world war. They instantly reshaped global alliances. The legacy of the Manhattan Project was vast, and it was immediate. Wartime cooperation fractured almost overnight. The U.S. passed the McMonaught Act in 1946, which temporarily ended nuclear cooperation even with their British allies. It sparks the massive Cold War nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union. Domestically, it permanently transferred control of atomic energy from the military over to the Civilian Atomic Energy Commission, cementing a huge network of national laboratories. Furthermore, declassified documents show that scientists had actually warned General Groves about radioactive fallout before the Trinity test even happened. Those early warnings really foreshadow the persistent environmental and radiation safety concerns that remain with us today. So the crucial point here is perfectly summarized by the brilliant physicist Niels Bohr. He looked at the awesome, devastating power unleashed by the project and realized the world had permanently changed. He said, "We are in a completely new situation that cannot be resolved by war." Humanity had tapped into an inexhaustible energy source, creating a weapon so destructive that traditional warfare between major global powers effectively became unthinkable. Which leaves us with a critical thought to ponder today. The Manhattan Project was, without a doubt, a triumph of scientific collaboration and incredible industrial might. But it unleashed a reality we are very much still grappling with. As old treaties shift and as new nuclear powers emerge on the global stage, how will humanity continue to navigate the persistent, existential threat of the atomic age we engineered some 80 years ago? Think about that for a bit. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.